At 73, I learned the hardest lesson of my life. The child you raise with love can become the one who hurts you the most. I trusted my own blood and paid for it with my body, my savings, and my silence. This is the night my son stopped being my son. I'm telling this story now, not because I enjoy reopening wounds, but because silence almost killed me. And if my voice can save even one woman like me from making the same mistakes, then every tear I've cried will have meaning. So listen to me carefully as I take you back to the life I thought I had before everything shattered. My name is Alara Moore. I am a 73-year-old widow, a retired school teacher. And for most of my life, I believed kindness was a shield, generosity was strength, and family was sacred. But those beliefs were slowly used against me by the very people I loved most, especially my only son Landon Moore and his wife Rhea, though back then I didn't see the danger. I only saw my child, the baby I once rocked through fevers, the boy whose scraped knees I kissed better, the man I defended even when my instincts whispered warnings I refused to hear, because a mother's heart is stubborn and hopeful even when it shouldn't be. And before the night that broke me, my life was quiet, predictable, and small in ways I thought were safe. I lived alone in the house my late husband Marcus and I bought decades ago. A modest place with creaking floors and a garden that used to bloom wildly before my knees betrayed me. And though grief had settled into my bones after Marcus passed, I filled my days with routines so I wouldn't feel the emptiness too loudly, volunteering at the local reading center, attending a weekly book circle, and most importantly, cooking for my son and his wife every weekend, because feeding them made me feel needed, and being needed made me feel alive. Even when gratitude was rare and appreciation was thinner than politeness, I told myself that love didn't need applause, that a mother's job was to give without counting. So I ignored the small humiliations, the way Rhea never called me mom, only my first name. Clipped and distant, the way my cooking was always almost right but never good enough. The way conversations with Landon slowly shifted from how were you feeling to can you help us with this? And we're short this month. And it's just temporary, a phrase that stretched into years. And when Marcus died, I received a modest settlement and pension. Nothing extravagant, but enough to keep me secure if I lived carefully. And I did live carefully, coupons, generic brands, postponed pleasures, while my son lived loudly, traveling, upgrading, posting smiling photos from places I'd only seen in magazines. And I never questioned how they afforded it because I trusted them. Because I trusted him, because he was my son. And when they asked for help with a down payment years ago, I gave it without hesitation, telling myself money could always be replaced, but family couldn't. And when emergencies followed emergencies, I unlocked my savings again and again, convincing myself this was what mothers were for, unaware that kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be consumed. And the truth is, exploitation doesn't begin with cruelty, it begins with comfort, with access, with trust, and I gave them all three freely, especially when I handed Landon an emergency debit card linked to my account, repeating the rules carefully like a prayer, only if you absolutely need it. And he nodded, hugged me, promised, and I believed him. Because mothers believe promises even when they shouldn't. And for months nothing seemed wrong. My balance dipped, but nothing alarming. Until one afternoon when my routine shifted slightly and fate stopped hiding. A cancelled meeting led me past a familiar cash machine, and there I saw Rhea, not as a wife, not as family, but as a stranger doing something secretive. Withdrawing money quickly, checking her surroundings, slipping cash away like guilt, and in that moment something inside me went cold. Not angry, not loud, just cold, the way truth feels when it finally arrives. And when I checked my account later with shaking hands, the pattern revealed itself mercilessly. Withdrawals on the same day, same amount, same time, week after week. Thousands drained quietly while I baked, read, trusted. And I remember sitting alone at my kitchen table staring at numbers that no longer felt real. Realizing the money I'd set aside for medical care, for survival, for dignity, was gone. Taken not by strangers, but by people who kissed my cheek on holidays. And the worst pain wasn't the theft, it was the betrayal. Because betrayal rearranges your past, poisoning memories you once cherished. And I still didn't call the police right away, didn't scream or accuse. because some foolish part of me still believed confrontation could fix this. That explanation could soften cruelty, that love could undo damage. So I invited them for dinner on the night meant for peace and warmth. The night families gather and forgive, thinking maybe this timing would remind them of humanity. And as I cooked, my hands steady despite my heart racing, I rehearsed calm words, believing dignity could protect me, never imagining that the people I welcomed into my home that night would leave me bleeding on the floor. And when they arrived early, confident, careless, drinking my wine and making plans with my money, something hardened in me, and when I finally spoke, laid the truth between us, the air shifted instantly. Denial turned to mockery. Mockery to blame, blame to cruelty. And when I realized Landon wasn't shocked, wasn't confused, but complicit, something inside me cracked forever. And when he said the words that will echo in my mind until I die, that I had more than I needed, that my future didn't matter, that I would die alone anyway, I understood that the son I raised was already gone, replaced by a man who saw me as an obstacle, a resource, an inconvenience. And when anger finally pushed me to defend myself, to demand they leave, violence followed swiftly and without warning. Hands that once held mine shoved me like I was nothing. My body slammed into familiar furniture. My skull met the floor of the home I sacrificed everything to keep. And as pain exploded and the world spun, I saw my ceiling blur and heard footsteps retreat. Heard my son's voice blaming me, even as I lay broken. And in that moment, bleeding and alone, I understood something devastatingly clear. Love does not protect you from abuse, and family does not guarantee safety. And as sirens later cut through the silence and strangers treated me with more care than my own child ever did, I knew my life had crossed a line it could never return from. And as I sat later in the quiet with ice against my head and shock settling into my bones, I promised myself one thing through tears and trembling resolve. This would not end with my silence. But the real shock didn't come from the fall or the blood. It came 2 days later, when my phone rang, and my son asked me for money again. 2 days after my son left me bleeding on the floor, he called me again, not to apologize, not to ask if I was alive. He called to ask for money. 2 mornings after that night, while my body still ached and my head throbbed with a pain that felt deeper than bone, I was sitting alone in the worn armchair my husband Marcus loved, an ice pack pressed against my temple, when my phone began vibrating on the table beside me, the screen lighting up with a name I hadn't yet found the strength to erase, Landon, my son, and I remember staring at it for a long moment, my hand shaking not from fear but from disbelief, because part of me still expected remorse, expected panic, expected a son desperate to know if his mother was alive. But when I answered, his voice was not soft with concern. It was strained with anxiety of a different kind, the kind people have when consequences start knocking, and after a brief, awkward greeting he asked the question that finally killed the last fragile illusion I had left. Did you cover the payment this month? And in that instant, everything inside me went quiet. Because pain I could survive, betrayal I could process. But entitlement layered over violence was something else entirely. And as I looked out the window at a grey, frozen morning, I realized my suffering had not changed him at all. And when I calmly asked why he assumed I would help, he exhaled sharply and said what he had said countless times before, that they were short, that it was temporary, that I usually stepped in, and that word, usually, felt like a confession. Not a habit, but an expectation. Proof that in his mind my role had never been mother, only provider. And when I reminded him of what he'd said to me that night, that my money wasn't his concern, that I would die alone anyway, the silence on the line stretched long enough for truth to seep through it. And I realized he wasn't calling because he felt guilt. He was calling because his safety net had disappeared. And when I told him calmly that the money was gone, that his wife had taken it, that he had known, that the hospital had records and authorities had photos, his voice cracked not with shame but with panic, and he begged, not for forgiveness, but for one last chance, repeating the same words that had excused years of neglect. Just this once, and something inside me finally hardened into steel, because I understood then that just this once was a lie people use when they have already taken everything they can. And I told him no, not loudly, not angrily, but firmly. and that no carried the weight of every meal I cooked, every excuse I made, every boundary I failed to draw. And when he realized the answer wouldn't change, desperation turned to manipulation, his voice lowering, reminding me of everything he would lose: the house, the image, the life he'd built with my sacrifice. And I listened quietly, realizing how little space there was for me in his fear. And when I finally said I was protecting myself now, that lawyers were involved and access was gone, his tone shifted, sharp and accusing, as if my survival were an act of betrayal. And when I ended the call, my hands didn't shake, because something unexpected happened. Clarity replaced grief. And in the hours that followed, as messages poured in from both him and his wife, swinging wildly between apologies and insults, I made decisions I should have made years earlier, locking down accounts, documenting everything, and learning words I never thought would apply to my life: elder abuse, financial exploitation, domestic assault. And while paperwork piled up and officials asked questions with professional concern, I felt something strange growing inside me. Not revenge, not hatred, but resolve, because for the first time since Marcus died, I wasn't shrinking to keep peace. I wasn't smoothing edges to protect others. I was standing still in my own truth. And as days passed and bruises slowly darkened, then faded, I began to see my past differently, recognizing patterns I once called love, but now understood as conditioning. And I grieved not just the son I lost, but the woman I used to be, the one who believed endurance was virtue and sacrifice guaranteed loyalty. And yet, amid that grief, something else emerged: relief. Because silence had been heavier than any injury. And as the investigation moved forward and legal consequences loomed closer for Landon and Rhea, I knew the hardest battle wasn't with them anymore. It was with the voice inside me that whispered I was cruel for choosing myself. A voice shaped by decades of being told a good mother never says no. And every day I answered that voice with the same truth: love without respect is not love. And survival is not selfish. And as winter slowly gave way to fragile signs of spring, I realized the real story wasn't about money or violence. It was about awakening. About the moment a woman stops shrinking to fit the roles others assign her, even when that role is motherhood. And I didn't know yet how far this path would take me, how public my pain would become, or how final the consequences would be. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would never be silent again. And just when I thought the worst was over, the courtroom forced me to relive everything, and my son's defense revealed a truth I was never meant to hear. I thought the violence was the worst part, until I heard how my own son described me in court. They didn't just steal my money, they rewrote my life, and I was forced to listen. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and cold air, a place designed to feel orderly and fair, yet nothing about it felt safe to me as I sat there with my hands folded tightly in my lap, my back straight the way I used to stand in classrooms, because even in fear I clung to dignity. And as I waited for my name to be called, memories flooded me uninvited. London's first day of school, his nervous smile, the way Marcus squeezed my hand and whispered that we were raising a good man, and I wondered how those memories could coexist with the man sitting across the room now, avoiding my eyes, dressed carefully, looking like someone who had everything to lose. While the first, the woman he had taken from, was reduced to evidence. And when the proceedings began and the questions came, calm and methodical, I answered them with the same honesty I had taught my students, describing the withdrawals, the confrontation, the assault, my voice steady even as my chest tightened, because truth has a strange way of carrying you when lies no longer can. And then it was his turn to speak, and I wasn't prepared for how quickly the knife would twist, because Landon didn't deny what happened. Instead, he reframed it, painting a picture of a mother who was confused, forgetful, difficult, a woman who didn't understand modern finances, a woman who misremembered conversations, a woman whose generosity was actually irresponsibility. And as those words echoed in that room, something inside me broke open in a way bruises never could. Because this wasn't just defense, it was erasure. An attempt to strip me of credibility, to turn age into weakness and motherhood into liability. And I realized then that the cruelty wasn't accidental, it was strategic, rehearsed. something he had practiced until it sounded reasonable. And as Ria testified to, her voice smooth and composed, I watched her describe me as volatile, controlling, emotionally unstable. And the woman she described was unrecognizable. A stranger stitched together from half-truths and convenient lies. And I sat there listening to my life being rewritten in real time, understanding with painful clarity how easily victims become villains when power shifts. And yet, as devastating as it was, something unexpected happened. The truth didn't collapse under their lies. It stood quietly beside them, supported by records, timestamps, witnesses, and patterns that told a story words could not undo. And when the judge finally looked at me, not as a confused old woman, but as a person, and asked how this had affected my life, I spoke without preparation, without defense, because no script could capture what betrayal does to a soul. And I told them about nights I woke gasping from dreams where my son's face turned away from me, about the way trust once lost poisons, even kindness offered by strangers, about how violence isn't only what breaks bones, but what convinces you that you deserved it. And when I finished, the room was silent in a way that felt heavy but honest. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt seen, not pitied, not dismissed, but seen. And as proceedings ended that day and decisions were deferred, I walked out of that building older than I'd ever felt, and yet lighter in a way I hadn't expected. Because speaking truth publicly had given me something my silence never did: power. And still, power doesn't erase pain. And that night alone in my house, I wandered through rooms filled with memories that now felt haunted, touching objects Marcus once fixed, shelves Landon once climbed, realizing how much of my identity had been wrapped around roles that no longer existed. And grief hit me then not like a wave, but like gravity, constant and exhausting. Because losing a child who is still alive is a special kind of mourning, one society doesn't know how to acknowledge. And in the days that followed, as neighbors whispered and distant relatives chose sides, I learned how quickly people judge when they haven't lived a life. And yet amid that judgment, unexpected support appeared, letters from strangers, quiet messages from women who recognized my story as their own, who had been told endurance was love and silence was virtue. And I understood then that my pain had reached beyond me, that my story had weight, and that frightened me almost as much as it strengthened me. Because visibility invites scrutiny, and scrutiny demands courage. And as the case moved forward, and the distance between me and my son became permanent, I faced a truth that no court ruling could soften. Reconciliation requires accountability. And accountability was something Landon still refused to offer. And as I sat one evening watching dusk settle over my garden, realizing how small my world had become and how wide my voice had traveled, I asked myself whether survival alone was enough, or whether I owed myself something more than endurance after a lifetime of sacrifice. And that question, whispered in the quiet, changed everything that came next, because just as the verdict approached, I made a decision that shocked everyone, a decision my son never saw coming. Before the judge gave a verdict, I made a choice that terrified even me. I stopped fighting to be understood and started fighting to be free. That's when everything changed. The decision didn't come in a dramatic moment. There was no thunder or sudden clarity. It came quietly one morning as I stood in my kitchen holding a chipped mug Marcus once loved, watching sunlight touch a crack in the wall I had ignored for years. And I realized how long I had lived surrounded by fractures I kept pretending were normal. How many parts of myself I had sealed off just to keep others comfortable. And for the first time I asked a question I had never allowed myself to ask before. What do I want now? Not what a good mother should do, not what would look forgiving or respectable, but what would allow me to breathe without fear. And the answer was terrifying in its simplicity. I wanted distance, I wanted peace, and I wanted my life back. Even if that meant releasing the last thread tying me to the child I raised. And so before the verdict was announced, before consequences were formally assigned, I instructed my lawyer to proceed without hesitation, to seek full protection orders, to secure every remaining asset, and to end all informal contact permanently. A move that stunned those who still believed reconciliation was inevitable simply because blood demanded it. And when word reached Landon that I was no longer open to mediation, that there would be no quiet forgiveness, no private repair. He reacted exactly as I had come to expect, with outrage disguised as heartbreak. Messages flooding in accusing me of cruelty, of abandonment, of destroying the family. As if family were something he hadn't already burned down himself. And reading those words no longer broke me. Because I finally understood something crucial. Guilt is a tool often handed to women to keep them compliant. And once you recognize it, it loses its power. And as the legal process reached its conclusion, I sat in that same courtroom again, not trembling this time, but steady, listening as boundaries were formalized and consequences confirmed. And when the judge looked at me and spoke about accountability and protection, I felt something lift that I hadn't known I was carrying, the burden of responsibility for another adult's choices. And walking out of that building afterward, I didn't feel victorious. I felt quiet, because closure doesn't roar. It exhales, and in the weeks that followed, life didn't magically become easy, but it became honest. And honesty, I learned, is a form of relief. Because without constant fear of being used or blamed, my days expanded in small but meaningful ways. I rearranged furniture not for guests but for comfort. I let go of routines that existed only to serve others, and for the first time in decades, my time belonged to me, and that freedom felt strange, almost irresponsible, as if I were breaking an unspoken rule that mothers must always remain available, always reachable, always willing to absorb pain to keep others whole. And yet, with each passing day, that rule lost its authority, and I began to see my reflection differently, not as someone worn down by age and loss, but as someone who had survived and chosen herself anyway. And that choice rippled outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. Strangers continued to reach out. Women shared their stories, some whispered, some furious, all relieved to know they weren't alone. And I realized then that my story had stopped being just mine. It had become a mirror for others. And that realization brought both responsibility and purpose. Because speaking out wasn't about revenge. It was about interruption, breaking a cycle that thrives in secrecy. And while my son faded into distance, no longer a daily presence, but a permanent lesson, I stopped measuring my worth by his approval or absence. Understanding finally that motherhood does not require self-destruction. And as seasons changed and my home slowly transformed from a place of memory into a place of intention, I felt something I hadn't felt since Marcus died, forward motion. Not forced, not hurried, but real, and yet, just as I began to believe this chapter had ended, life presented me with one final reckoning. A moment that would test whether my newfound strength was temporary or permanent. Because months later, when I thought the past was finally behind me, my doorbell rang, and what stood on the other side forced me to choose who I had truly become. When my doorbell rang that evening, I knew my old life was testing me one last time. Some endings don't come quietly, they demand a final choice. This was mine. It was early evening when the doorbell rang. The kind of quiet hour where the world feels paused. And I remember standing still in my hallway, listening to the echo fade, knowing without knowing who stood on the other side. Because some instincts are born from pain and never lie. And as I approached the door slowly, my heart calmed in a way that surprised me. I realized this moment was not about fear anymore, but about confirmation. And when I opened the door and saw Landon standing there, thinner, tense, eyes darting as if searching for a version of me that no longer existed. Time seemed to fold in on itself, memories colliding with reality. The boy I raised layered over the man who hurt me. And for a brief second, I felt that familiar pull, the reflex to comfort. To ask if he was okay, to soften. But it passed like a ghost. Because standing there was not my child seeking forgiveness, but an adult facing consequences he could no longer outrun. And he spoke quickly, urgently, words tumbling over each other about misunderstandings, about pressure, about how everything had gone too far. And as he talked, I noticed something remarkable about myself. I wasn't absorbing his emotions. I wasn't shrinking to manage his discomfort. I was simply listening, detached, grounded. And when he finally paused, waiting for reassurance, for rescue, for me to make it all better as I always had, I felt a deep, steady sadness, not sharp or violent, but final. And I told him calmly that he could not be there, that boundaries had been set, that this conversation was over, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with loss of control. Because people panic when they realize their power is gone. And he accused me then of being heartless, of choosing strangers and systems over blood. And I let those words pass through me without lodging in my chest. Because I finally understood that boundaries often feel like cruelty to those who benefited from your silence. And when I closed the door gently but firmly, locking it behind me, my hands didn't shake. My knees didn't buckle. I stood there breathing, realizing that strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like refusal. And in the days that followed, something profound settled into my life. Not joy exactly, but peace, the kind that comes from alignment, from knowing your actions match your truth. And as weeks turned into months, my world continued to expand in quiet ways. I spoke publicly, not chasing attention, but answering it when it came. Sharing my story so others could recognize themselves sooner than I had. And letters continued to arrive, some from daughters, some from mothers, some from women older than me who thought it was too late to change. And each time I read their words, I felt a responsibility I accepted willingly. Because survival stories don't exist to shock, they exist to guide. And I learned that healing is not about forgetting what happened, but about refusing to let it define what happens next. And though grief still visits me, because a mother never fully stops mourning the child she hoped for, it no longer controls me. It sits beside gratitude. Gratitude for my body that healed, for my voice that returned, for the wisdom that came at a cost, but arrived nonetheless. And when I look at my reflection now, I don't see a victim. I see a woman who endured, who learned, who chose herself without apology. And if there is one truth I want you to carry from my story, it is this: love should never require your destruction. Not at any age, not from anyone, and silence does not keep families together. It only keeps pain hidden. And I am telling you this now, not as a warning filled with fear, but as permission to draw lines, to protect your future, to believe that it is never too late to reclaim your life, because I am 73 years old, and I am finally free. If you've stayed with me until this moment, then my story has already reached the heart it was meant to reach. Because stories like mine aren't told for sympathy, they're told so silence doesn't win. So pain doesn't stay hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. And so women, especially mothers and grandmothers, understand that love should never cost them their safety, their dignity, or their future. And if you see yourself in even one part of my journey, please know this: it is not weakness to protect yourself. It is wisdom, and it is never too late to choose peace over guilt, truth over fear, and life over endurance. And if my voice helped you feel less alone today, then share this story with someone who needs permission to be strong. Because sometimes hearing you're not wrong is the beginning of freedom.